Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really impressed with the turnout. I'm at a smaller school, and so I love the idea that there's so many people here to talk about adaptation. I'm really happy to be here. My name's Breena Holland, and I'm going to talk about climate adaptation and political capabilities. The central question that I wanted to address and start thinking about in my own research is, what does procedural justice require in the context of climate change? And particularly in the context of climate adaptation politics. So by climate adaptation politics, I'm talking about decision-making processes that are led by government institutions. You might think about politics as also something that comes from the grassroots. And in what I'm going to talk about today, I'm thinking about institutions, governmental institutions, and agencies that are involved with government institutions in addressing problems of climate adaptation. And by procedural justice, I'm also talking about justice of the processes and not the outcomes that the processes produce. So questions of fairness of access and participation and recognition within the processes that are driving government and other agency efforts to adapt to climate change. One of the theories that I actually draw on is the capabilities approach to justice. This is normally understood as a substantive approach to justice, and that it's concerned with outcomes. And it's concerned with protecting a sort of list of 10 central human functional capabilities at a threshold level for each person in society. So I'm going to actually just draw on one of those capabilities in the conversation today that's concerned with issues of procedural justice. But these are the capabilities. They're normally treated as sort of a species of human rights. So they're the things that are supposed to be most important in living a good human life, that when you think about something, climate adaptation or other forms of environmental politics, what is it that we want to protect? We want to protect these capabilities at a threshold level. A lot of the conversation about this theory goes on about whether these are the appropriate things that should be on the list of what matters in human rights, in human life. But the one I want to talk about today is this one called control over one's environment, and that's separated into political control and material control, and I'm interested in the political dimension. And here's what that is defined in this substantive theory of justice as being able to participate effectively in political choices that govern one's life, having the right of political participation, protections of free speech, and association. So this is, in the theory of the capabilities approach, is fleshed out, as you can see, at a really abstract level, as it is right here. And the purpose for that is so that it can actually be applied to specific contexts and characterized in a more substantive way. What does this actual political participation require? What does it mean to participate effectively in choices that govern one's life? To start to think about that, the next thing I'd like to do is to draw on David Schlosberg's what I would call a procedural account of recognition justice. Sorry, I missed that. That is, he develops in this book, Defining Environmental Justice. I encourage everyone to go and get a copy of that immediately. And what Schlosberg says, first and foremost, is that justice requires recognition and valuing of the natural environment's role in enabling people to maintain identity as distinct and place-based cultural communities. Okay, so he's, in this instance, talking about respecting and valuing people as attached to particular places or environments that are central to their way of life and cultural identity. This seems really important when we're thinking about what it should mean to have a political capability to do something. A lot of theories on recognition justice talk about that. And the reason is because mostly our identity is shaped through our relationships to others, and our feelings of self-worth, self-respect, and autonomy are made possible only when we're recognized by others for who we are, right? And so part of our own self-realization actually means that we have to have that kind of recognition coming from others. And secondly, this is something that he sort of follows some work by Neil Adler and John Barnett in talking about in more recent work on climate adaptation, where he says that a general right to political participation is not meaningful unless it gives communities some locus of control over their destinies as part of a recognition of identity and place. Okay, so you can draw on these sort of ideas to argue that a procedurally just approach to adaptation politics is only meaningful if it gives people control over political outcomes in some way, or at least control over the processes of participation. And I will return to that because it's obviously very relevant to some of the ideas that John Barnett was just speaking about aligning knowledge systems and what it means to do that. But recognition of others needs to come accompanied with some sort of substantive political power. So drawing on that sort of vague abstract characterization of what a political capability is, and then the work that Schlosberg has sort of already done on recognition justice, this is how I want to define procedural adaptation justice. What it requires is that for each person that's going to be impacted by climate adaptation policies, we have to protect a threshold of the political capability to control decisions that determine whether and how adaptation will change relationships to the natural environment that comprise distinct and place-based cultural identities. And what I mean by this more generally is that adaptation justice requires securing for each person a threshold level of political power to shape adaptation, okay? So that's what I want to start thinking about, is understanding a political capability as a capability or a political power, having the political power to shape the outcomes of adaptation. In so many instances, case studies I've been looking at, that seems to be lacking. People are brought into the process in ways that don't give them proper political power over the outcomes of adaptation. So what does it mean to have this political power? When I first started reading this literature, I had no idea it was so large. So what I'm going to talk about is an immense amount of work being done on this. I went through a bunch of adaptation case studies, and what I was starting to do was just sort of look at the political claims that were being made about the failures of adaptation. What's wrong with the politics of adaptation? Why are the political processes that the governments and other agencies are engaging in, how are they failing? And I've found that the sort of, not surprisingly, because I'm a political theorist, that the claims that were being articulated by people tend to map on to the claims that are treated as goals of deliberative democratic politics or recognition politics. So with respect to the goals of democratic deliberation, there's a lot of conversation in the literature about minimizing barriers to internal and external exclusion. So the internal issues of democratic deliberation and potential exclusion refer to norms of dialogue and communication that treat some people's voices and modes of presentations in participatory settings as more legitimate or more worthy than others. That comes up a lot, where some people's voices are not actually properly respected in the deliberative context. And then also there's issues of external barriers to deliberation and proper participation. And this seems to have a lot to do with getting access to decision-making contexts, who has access, are the decisions that matter going on behind closed doors. Do people have other responsibilities that lead them to away from the potential to participate in conversations about adaptation? And then the other kind of claims that I saw in this literature is about the value, about valuing how communities understand the environment and its importance to them. Okay, and here there's both the sort of identity-based claims and resource and status-based claims. So the identity-based claims are that people's sort of the relationships that they have to nature or the environment that's going to be changed by adaptation planning and implementation are not actually being properly respected by the plans that emerge from the participatory dialogue, severing of relationships to place that matter to people. This is one big problem. And then the other one is, of course, that some of the decision-making occurs in places that people don't have the right resources to participate in, or they don't have the status to even talk to the important decision makers. Those are obviously things that have come up in many forms of politics. There are several common forms of exclusion, non-recognition, misrecognitions that arise in the context of adaptation politics that are articulated, as I'm seeing and referring to, as claims about deliberation and goals of recognition. One is that people are not recognized or misrecognized, okay? So this seems to be especially common in top-down approaches to adaptation, or in places where there's weak institutions. That means there won't be any state-led effort at adaptation. Okay? So In the traditional models of expert knowledge that were talked about a little bit by John Barnett, experts are determining who belongs where, what activities are appropriate in particular places, who has responsibilities, and which institutions can legitimately assume responsibility. And the problem of non-recognition or misrecognition has to do with how place is presented and also with how people are presented. So I think, John, the case that you presented really clearly demonstrated that there's a wealth of local knowledge and expertise, right, that's not being recognized in the community, and that a politics that actually treats people as authorities and as distinctly prepared for dealing with the problem, as opposed to being fatalistic and incapable and not being innovative of responding to them, is very important if you actually want to engage those people in successfully participating in the politics and determining what their adaptation outcomes are going to be. It's the same thing with place. In a lot of instances where certain places are framed as a legal subject in this very narrowly scientific way to problems of flooding and erosion, as opposed to a lived community where people have a history and an identity that's surrounding the area, or bound up with the area. Okay, another problem, common problem, things when people are heard but not understood. Okay, so these are common sort of instances of adaptation politics where you have a top-down decision-making process that's trying to be dressed up as a bottom-up process. Maybe common in sort of comment and response type of sessions where people have the opportunity to state what matters to them about an adaptation plan, but participation is actually intended to lend political legitimacy to decisions that are made prior to citizen participation. So people hear what they want to hear. You get a plan that sort of happens to magically look like the ones to support a decision that was already predetermined. Okay. Common in a lot of form of politics. You see it as well in the case studies on adaptations. So citizens' views might be heard, but what they say isn't understood by those who are charged with listening. Third one, when people are understood but then ignored, okay? So citizens are understood by those who engage with them, but their views are ignored by those who have the power to incorporate their views into a plan that effectively protects what citizens care about. So for instance, if a government agency hires a consultant group to go out and actually have an engagement with the community, right, the consultant group may come out of that where they've actually heard and understood what matters to citizens in the kind of adaptation plan that's produced, but in fact that gets ignored because those consultants don't make the decisions and it's not adequately incorporated into the plan. So citizens don't have the opportunity to construct, discuss, or promote alternative options besides those that are favored by decision makers. And then finally, this one seemed to be quite common, when citizens are understood, but not at the level of government that has decision authority. And I'm distinguishing this from number 3 because it often seems to be the case that the decision about what needs to be done is made at a regional or state level, or it's coming from that level, or what adaptation requires is coming from that level, but all of the sort of local input and voice is at the local level. So there's a sort of just shifting sort of location of authority that in some cases seems like you get an argument that from a local government that my hands are tied, I can't actually respond to your views because the decision is made at a different level, okay? So these are just sort of things that actually threaten to undermine the capabilities of people to actually shape adaptation outcomes. Okay. Common things, you might think of them as involved in any form of democratic politics. I've been attending every city council meeting since the beginning of the summer where I live, and you see those sort of things playing out all the time. So what I wanted to do, because I think that they're, again, well reflected in the case studies on adaptation, was start to think about what the opportunities and barriers are for addressing those problems in the context of adaptation politics in particular, as distinct from normal environmental politics or other forms of democratic politics. And so I started to sort of outline what I thought were some of the distinct features of adaptation politics. One is that the causal actor is diffuse, although as we've already heard today, even if climate change is caused by people in different places, there's actually instances of sort of local causes that aggregate the negative impacts of climate change. So it's not entirely true that they're always diffuse. The causal actor is diffuse because it can be aggravated by very particular local causal actors. Second is the time scale. Climate adaptation requires short and long-term planning on an ongoing basis. Okay, so a lot of political problems, especially in the area of environmental politics, are just talking about trying to come up with a short-term solution to an immediate exposure to an environmental harm. This one, I'm looking forward to what people think about it, but it seems to me distinct. Climate adaptation is distinct from environmental justice cases because in environmental justice cases, we're often talking about the uncertainty of the impact, uncertainty surrounding the impact of harm on the human body. So it involves really complicated questions of toxicology in order to sort of figure out what the harm is. Whereas in the case of climate adaptation, it's a really easily understood harm. Like there's gonna be a fire, your house is gonna flood. It's not something that the cause and the relationship of human activities to it may be uncertain, but it's not hard to figure out what the implications are if there are flooding for your particular home. So you have a situation where it's an easily understood harm, even if the predicted likelihood of the harm is uncertain. And then in many instances, government scale relates to that last problem I was talking about where you've got to get coordination across multiple levels of government. And then another distinct feature of adaptation politics is that in many cases, communities have to act collectively. Like if you're talking about moving a whole community, it's not like you can leave somebody behind, but there's a sort of natural collective constituency that's relevant to the political decisions, and everybody's got to move or nobody's going to move. Securing political power to shape adaptation. So what I wanted to do was think about how those common problems that come up and how the unique features of adaptation might lead us to think about adaptation politics in a slightly different way and what it means to secure political capabilities in that context in a slightly different way. And I'll just talk about one, which is there's obviously a changing role for expertise. How we overcome this problem of being heard but not understood is relevant to this. And like I was saying, in cases of normal environmental politics where we're talking about particular polluters, it's often that you need a lawyer or a toxicologist to come in as the expert and help a community politically mobilize and develop their political power. But in the case of adaptation politics, because the harm is uncertain, I mean the harm is certain and the sort of cause of it may be uncertain, but we're not talking about deconstructing the claims about probability of harm due to exposure to a toxin. Instead, we're talking about what do we want and how do we convey that to the people that are making the decisions about the plan? And so it's an instance where I think there's an opening of the door for a lot more room for a variety of expertise and not necessarily legalistic or toxicology, those kinds of environmental science experts, but people that are more able to help convey the importance of what matters to people about a place, its cultural importance, and its relevance to their identity. And so it's really relevant in situations where there's a lack of understanding about the problem rather than the potential to be ignored. So what I was trying to do in my paper is to actually go through and identify instances where what we're actually doing is talking about the distinct features of adaptation and how that means what we mean, how that translates into different understandings of what the political power to shape adaptation requires. And I'll stop there and talk more about those other features besides the changing role of expertise later. Thank you.